Hello everyone, my name is Andrew, and today we're going to be discussing how to use an N4, which is a notice to end your tenancy early for non-payment of rent. Now before we get into this, I do want to point out that the N4 is one of the most commonly used forms by landlords in Ontario. And largely that is because it is the backbone of what it is you need to serve when the tenant doesn't pay rent if you're looking to terminate the tenancy as a result. However, if you're interested in collecting the rent but do not want to terminate the tenancy, which there are circumstances where that will be done, you want to check out this other video right here, which is the L9 video that tells you how to apply to the tribunal just to collect rents and not to terminate the tenancy. So first of all, what is an N4? An N4 is a form that you will serve to terminate the tenancy early for non-payment of rent. Now, it's not a very difficult form to fill out, but you have to make sure to keep things as accurate and correct as possible, because when you do use this form to file your subsequent L form, you want to make sure that everything lines up accordingly. And it is very important to do these things because if you don't, your whole case can get chucked if it does end up going to the landlord and tenant board. Now, generally speaking, as we're going through the form, there are a pretty concise set of instructions that are already on the form that tells you under what circumstances you can serve this and what you cannot. Now, when do you use this form? Assuming that you have a standard tenancy and the rent cycles goes on the 1st of every month, if the tenant defaults and does not pay their rent on the 1st, you can serve them an N4 on the 2nd. Now, there are a few stipulations here for almost all the forms that basically entail that if you need to serve your tenant this notice by mail, you have to allot an extra 5 days. If you're unsure about the count of the days, always make sure to allow a little more just to make sure that your dates line up accordingly. Now let's talk about how to fill out the form. As always, you want to make sure that you fill out your name and the tenant's name correctly, and both of them have to be matching all identifications and as they are according to the lease agreement. Again, remember that if there are multiple people on the lease agreement, you need to include those multiple names on the N4 for your form to be valid. Now, the most important thing on the N4 is to make sure that the termination date corresponds with the rent cycle the tenant has in accordance with their lease agreement. For example, if your lease agreement requires that the tenant be paying their rent monthly, you have to make sure to allow for 14 days after you give the tenant that notice. And again, remember, if you're serving it by mail, you want to be adding an extra 5 days on that date. The next thing you want to know is that to go with an N4, the LTB requires that you file an L1 application form, which is the application to evict a tenant for non-payment of rent and to collect the rent that the tenant owes. If you want to know more about how to fill out that form, we're going to be doing another video. We'll leave a link to it somewhere around here. It's important to note that the subsequent fee that comes with filing that L1 is now $201. Now, one of the common mistakes that a lot of people make when filling out the section indicating the money's owed to the landlord, they end up filling extra things that might not necessarily be part of the rent. And you're not supposed to fill that out in this form. In this form, you're supposed to strictly keep things to rent. So if you have something in there where the tenant was also supposed to take care of lawn maintenance or snow removal and they were failing to do that and they owe money as a result of that, you cannot include this in the form because it's specifically to end the tenancy because of non-payment of rent only. If you want to get some of those other arrears, you have to apply using a different form. You cannot include other things such as parking or other amenities in this form. Now, as we move further down the form, we're going to take a look at the 3 rows where you are essentially supposed to put in your calculations. Now, in that section, if your tenant happens to owe more than 3 months of rent, which means you're filling this form out considerably late, you want to use that first row to combine the previous months and put the total amount at the end. And then subsequently, you will now fill out the second and the third row as the last 2 months that the tenant hasn't paid rent. Now, one thing that you should keep in mind is that when you are indicating which months the tenant paid rent, and this is important to take this into consideration, is if your tenant did not pay rent in May and then your tenant did pay rent in June, they did not pay June's rent, they paid May's rent. So it's important to understand that when the tenant is topping up the rent, they are paying the original months that they missed. So you have to make sure to keep that in consideration when you are filling out the sections under how much rent is owing. You should not use this form to tell the tenant they owe you amounts that are not part of the rent, such as the last month's rent deposit or an NSF charge. And moving on to the next section, you're going to fill out some of your own personal information, sign off on it, and then you're going to deliver the document. Another thing I want you to remember is that you cannot give this notice to them by taping this notice onto the door. They might receive it and everything might be fine, but they can simply state that they received it in this manner and the LTB might reject it later on. So make sure to either hand deliver it or give it to them by mail. Now, what if your tenant does pay you the rent amount within the allotted period? Well, if they pay you within that period, you are not able to file with the LTB using that L1 form afterwards, and essentially makes the form void. void. And if your tenant happens to be doing this every month, you want to look into filing an N8 form, which is to evict your tenant for continuous and repetitive late rent payment. If you want to know about that, we'll leave a link to it somewhere around here. Now, if your tenant pays the total rent owed after you have filed an L1 form, that means that they will now become responsible for that filing fee that you paid. And whether or not they actually pay it or not is going to mean you have to apply again to have that rent collected. So it's important to notify the tenant of this if you're dealing with them, that if they do not pay within that allotted period, you will be filing with the LTB. And what that's going to mean is they will have to be responsible to the fee. Oftentimes, this is very encouraging for a lot of people to make sure that they pay their bills on time, and also simple conversations to make sure that they understand that you have your own bills to pay and they need to pay theirs to make sure that everything works smoothly. So let's look at step 1. You serve the N4, complete it correctly, and you give that to your tenant, let's say by hand, or you give it to them by mail, adding those 5 days as required. Step 2 is going to be to wait to see if your tenant is actually going to pay their rent within that allotted period. If they do pay the rent, your form becomes void and you're starting from scratch again, but at least you have your rent. Step 3 is going to be if the tenant fails to pay their rent, what is it that you do? Well, in this case, you're going to be filing that L1 form and applying to the landlord and tenant board. Remember that the earliest date you can file your L1 is going to be indicated on the N4 form. Now, step 3 starts if they fail to pay the rent within the allotted period of time by which you're going to be filing the L1 form, and the filing fee for the L1 is going to be $201, as we mentioned before. Step 4 is going to be waiting for your hearing date, and this is usually going to be within 1.5 months. Now, something to consider is that with the pandemic and the way things have been working, definitely hearing dates have been coming back sometimes well beyond 1.5 months, but typically speaking, that has been the standard waiting period. Step 6 is going to be attending the hearing. Now, if you're unable to go yourself, I do highly recommend hiring a paralegal to attend on your behalf, and there is a degree of formality that is good to abide by. You want to make sure that any evidences that you're bringing to the matter, depending on what it is that you are arguing about, present that several days beforehand, making sure that the tenant also has any evidences that you're bringing forth as well. Make sure to double check everything before attending to ensure that your forms have been filled out correctly. There are other forms that you can file if you have to make any corrections before attending the hearing. Now, usually what happens at this point is that when you're attending the hearing, the tenant can either pay the rent that they owe on the spot, or they can negotiate at the LTB to pay the rent within a certain time period. And generally speaking, if the rent owed is not very large amounts, the adjudicator will often grant the tenant an opportunity to pay the rent within that period of time. Now, it's important for you as an applicant to make sure that you advocate for yourself that things are fair. For example, there's nothing wrong with telling the adjudicator to allow you some recourse if the tenant does not comply. For example, if you're attending and the tenant owes you $5,000 and they say that they're going to pay that within 3 or 5 days, if you can document that they do not pay you or that they did not pay you after you're done your hearing, you should be able to file for an eviction thereafter and not have to go through the entire process. And an adjudicator can allow you for an opportunity to do this. You just have to ask, and that falls under Section 78, where you can apply to the board without hearing if the tenant fails to comply with the order set by the LTB. But if you go to the hearing and your tenant is unable to pay the rent and the adjudicator orders for an eviction, if they do not pay the rent, then you will get an order in the mail after they fail to comply, and you should be able to use that order to take it to the sheriff's office and apply for a formal eviction thereof. If you have any more questions about this, feel free to drop a comment in the comments below, or we're going to leave a phone number here so you can text if you need any help with your landlord and tenant situation. In the meantime, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and check us out for more LTB forums.